Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. It's the end of another really hard and painful week. And I've wondered over the past 6 months how much more the human spirit can take. It's devastating surprise after surprise. And this week, I know that we were watching, just horrified by these deadly explosions that took place in Beirut, and heard the awful numbers that I think we might all know by heart at this point, that a warehouse storing 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate blew up. It was a devastating blast with devastating reach. More than 150 people have died, and thousands of people have been injured severely. The hospitals are totally overrun, some hospitals destroyed. I saw a video and heard stories about people running down the staircases of their buildings, trying to get out before the buildings crumbled, and being turned away at the hospital because there's just no room. Electrical outages across the city. It's catastrophic. And I read this week that the reverberations, the echoes of this blast were felt as far as 100 miles away. They were felt in Cyprus, that the world was shaking because of the enormity of this blast. And Eva showed me an image that she found. Someone superimposed this blast over Venice just so that we could see how far it went. And it was all the way to Agoura and Long Beach, and stretching deep in to Los Angeles, almost hitting downtown. I mean, it's absolutely massive. And it's horrifying to see this thriving, bustling, cosmopolitan Middle Eastern city that looks so much like Tel Aviv, that was already in the throes of political and economic upheaval and pandemic on top of it, just flattened by this blast. A horrific tragedy and horrific loss. And then responses started coming in from around the world. And one of them just broke my Jewish heart. And so I want to take a few minutes today and just name it and talk about it as a community. I'm talking about a Facebook post that came from a former member of Knesset named Moshe Feiglin, who argued that had that warehouse not blown up, those munitions would have rained down on Jews in Israel. And he noted that the explanation happened in honor of the holiday of Tu B'Av, which was the day actually that it occurred, the 15th day of the month of Av. He said it was a true and huge thank you to God and all of the geniuses and heroes, really, who organized this for us, this wonderful celebration in honor of the Day of Love. And my body's trembling even as I share these words, because I don't want these words to be out there in the world. I don't want people to hear me saying this now and say, God, I didn't know that a Jew responded to that horrific human tragedy in such a terrible way. I don't want people to think that that is who we are. I don't want anyone to think that this might be, God forbid, a representative voice in the Jewish community or in the Israeli Jewish community. And yet I'm so aware of how we in our community expect that all anti-Semitic voices, even those that are decidedly unrepresentative of the communities that they come from, are roundly condemned by everyone in the community from which those voices emerge. And so I feel that we can't hide from this terrible voice within our own community. We can't just hope that no one heard it. We can't just pray that it'll get lost in the news cycle, because even though Feiglin's message of raw hatred has far been outweighed by many public statements and gestures of support from Jews and from Israelis all around the world, from President Ruby Rivlin, who said, we share the pain of the Lebanese people and we sincerely reach out with offerings of aid during this difficult time. We saw how the lights of City Hall in Tel Aviv were lit up right in the spot where Rabin was assassinated, lit up to look like the Lebanese flag. And the mayor of Tel Aviv publicly said, our common humanity takes precedence over all conflict. Our hearts are with the Lebanese people in light of this terrible disaster that's befallen them. And I would love to just focus on those voices, but in fact, I know that this member of Knesset, former member of Knesset, is not alone. He was a representative in the government. He served for 3 years as a minister in the ruling party. And also his voice does in fact represent a small and dangerous subset of our people who hold a dramatically different understanding of what it fundamentally means to be a Jew and to be a human being than you do and than I do. And I want to sit here on this Shabbat and I want to say that Judaism is inauthentic and it's fabricated and it's drawn from the wells of hatred and trauma. But in fact, if we look to this week's Parsha, to Parshat Eikev, we see the roots of it right here in our Torah, in our most sacred text. Eikev begins with Moshe touting the vengeful God who promises to make our enemies hurt. And here's the line that sticks out to me this week. You shall destroy all the people that the Lord your God delivers to you. Lo tachos einchai aleihem. You should show them no pity. Show them no pity, from the shoresh chus, to have compassion. And what's at the heart of this heartlessness? Lo tira mehem. Don't be afraid of them. It's fear that steals our ability to hold them, these human beings, with love, to have pity for them, to sympathize with them. It's fear. And yet, rather than the Torah coming and saying, so work to eradicate your fear. We all experience fear. Fight the fear and engage with love. Instead of that, the Torah here advocates sealing off our hearts, not only treating the other as our enemy, but preventing our hearts from hurting when the enemy suffers. It's right there in the text. I have a friend who's an academic who argues that it's intellectually dishonest to say Judaism teaches or the Torah says, because any statement like that is really a gross oversimplification, because in fact, we know that Judaism is a complex system of laws and practices and social norms that were born and developed over thousands of years in diverse communities across the globe. That Judaism is multidimensional and complicated and nuanced and internally contradictory. And I agree with him more or less, though I do wonder, does that mean that we can't say that anything is a Jewish value, that anything is a Jewish idea? So with his assertion in my head, I'm always sensitive to the tensions, to the machlokot that appear in our tradition. And I often lift up these tensions, not only the tensions between different perspectives that different rabbis hold, but also assertions from the Torah that are then refuted by rabbinic teachings, like one that we talked about just a couple of weeks ago, offering a kind of internal rebuke of the values that are at the heart of our system. Today, I need to point to that tension right here in the same Torah portion, because how are we to understand that in the midst of the admonitions from a vengeful God, warnings about showing no pity to the enemy, after we read about the mitzvot of suffering with drought and famine if we don't follow the letter of the law precisely, all of a sudden, a few chapters after show no pity, we read, "V'ahavtem et hager ki gerim heitem be'eretz Mitzrayim." And yet you must love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. This is some kind of spiritual whiplash in this week's Parsha. This is one of the more than 36 times in the Torah that we read that we are called to love the stranger because we were strangers and we understand what it means to suffer. We're told, don't fear the other. The only thing you should fear is the Holy One, is God. Fear in the way of experiencing awe, like Rabbi David shared last night. Here I see that the Torah is offering us a different way. The way of Rabbi Daniel Roth, the brother of our beloved community member, Hannah Roth. And I want to offer blessings to Hannah and Kathleen, Kathleen's father, and the whole family on this Shabbat. Rabbi Daniel Roth, who's an Israeli Jew and a rabbi, he saw the devastation in Beirut that we all saw this week. And it made him think of a pasuk, of a verse from Mishlei that says, if your enemy's hungry, feed him bread. If he's thirsty, give him water to drink. And without doubting the tensions over the last many decades between Israel and Lebanon, Rabbi Daniel Roth helped launch the campaign Israeli flying aid, where he set out to raise over 1 million shekels of life-saving aid that would go to medicine and medical supplies and food for the victims of these blasts. This is a campaign that's designed to specialize in providing aid to communities and countries that don't have any diplomatic ties to Israel. He's going right to the heart of the tension point. This is a rabbi who has dedicated his life as a teacher of Torah to helping us understand conflict resolution, to promoting dialogue between senior Jewish and Muslim leaders around the world, people who are not inclined to see and understand one another's perspectives. This is a rabbi who spends his time teaching about the danger of views that are so fiercely held and so fear-driven that they lead to violence and a diminishing of God's image in the world. And now through this work, this week, is providing his own counter-testimony to those who think like that former member of Knesset, celebrating the laser light show that he got this year for Tu B'Av. Yes, I want to tell you that our Torah holds both of those views. We can't say only that the Torah calls us to love the stranger without also noting that the Torah calls us to have no pity on the enemy. So maybe there's not a Judaism so much as many Judaisms. And you and I and Feiglin and Roth, we all have to determine how we will live, which Judaism will be the guiding force in our lives, which Torah, which core values will animate our decisions every single day as we walk down these sometimes treacherous paths. And I know enough about Jewish history to be able to imagine that it's some chapters of our long and painful past, the ideology of have no pity may have been very comforting to our people. It may have even been necessary, essential to our survival in a cruel and unjust world. But I believe that there is no place for that thinking today. I have no question about who the world needs us to be today. We must be the ones who, in the face of hatred, stand up for love, who even when those who are considered our enemies are aching, we open our hearts instead of closing them down, who even when others are silent will speak out, who spend as much time and as much resources fighting anti-Semitism as we do fighting racism and hatred and oppression of the other. We must be those who uphold a Judaism that is born in wakeful resistance to the status quo, who recognize the chasm between our great audacious dreams for human beings and the reality that we live in, and are willing to dedicate everything we have to narrowing the gap between those two. Right now, the world needs us to uphold a Judaism that calls us to fight not only for our own liberation, but for everybody's, not only for our own redemption, but for our neighbor's redemption, not only for justice for the Jews, but for justice and equity and peace and healing and love for all of God's children. In all of the aching and breaking of the last 6 months, with crisis upon crisis and suffering upon suffering, there's one thing that I am so clear about today, that the world needs us to hear, V'ahavtem et hager. You must love the other, the stranger, the vulnerable. Ki gerim ha'item be'eretz Mitzrayim. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You know what suffering is like. We know what suffering is like. So on this Shabbat, I say, may the memory of all of those whose lives were lost this week be a blessing. May those who were injured, who lost limbs, who suffered brain trauma, who lost their homes, who lost their livelihoods, who've been re-traumatized, may they all find strength to be held with love on their healing journey. May this tragedy only awaken us further to the depth of responsibility that we, each of us, hold toward one another, all of us created in God's image. So please support Rabbi Roth's initiative, ifaid.com. Keep your heads and your hearts open. Keep your spirits up. Stay hopeful. This too is a Jewish path. I wish you all Shabbat Shalom, a Shabbat of peace and love.